Thank you, Miraj, for the introduction. And hello everyone, and thank you for all of you for joining us today. And this is Jess. I'm Regulatory Manager at the Global Product Compliance Group. And today I will give you a presentation on chemical regulation in Taiwan. And I will focus on registration, annual reporting, and the compliance requirements. So the outline of today's presentation. So I will give you an overview of chemical regulations in Taiwan, and then I will focus on Toxic and Concerned Chemical Substance Control Act, TCC-SCA, which was amended last year. And I will give you an overview of the major revisions from this amendment. Later, I will talk about the registration of new and existing chemical substances. Here, I will talk about the exemptions, who can register, and the registration for existing and new chemical substances, and what data are acceptable for standard registration. After this, I will talk about the timeline for standard registration for 106 PECs and the registration fee of this. And I will also talk about the confidential business information, the CBI, and the annual reporting. And I will conclude this presentation with a take-home message. Okay, so chemicals are managed by different competent authorities in Taiwan, depending on their intended use. For example, like pesticide, it's taken care by the Council of Agriculture under the Agro-Pesticide Act. And for pharmaceuticals, food additives, and cosmetics, they are regulated by respective regulations. So if we are talking about chemicals, then it is these two regulations that we should pay attention to. The first one is the chemical at workplace, and this is taken care by the Ministry of Labor. And the regulation is called Occupational Safety and Health Act. And under this act, there will be regulations on priority management chemicals, controlled chemicals, and also the hazard communication, the GHS part. And the other one is about the industrial chemical, which is the focus of today, is regulated by the Environmental Protection Administration, the EPA. And the act is called the Toxic and Concerned Chemical Substance Control Act. And under this act, the act will take care of the toxic substances with the classification 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the concerned substances. So, about the Toxic and Concerned Chemical Substance Act. So, on January 9, 2019, last year, Taiwan's EPA amended its chemical regulation law, Toxic Chemical Substance Control Act. And this act was renamed into Toxic and Concerned Chemical Substance Control Act, TCC-SCA. And the amendment can be seen as an effort to harmonize with regulations around the world, such as EU REACH, Korea REACH, and other international regulations. And in comparison with the TCC-SCA, as you can see here, the release of the TCC-SCA last year provide a legal base on registration and reporting for chemical substances, as you can see in Chapter 4 here, and the accident prevention and emergency responses in Chapter 5. It also has a comprehensive legal base for audit, inspection, and the financial matters. To summarize the major points of the amendment in 2019 in 4 aspects, the first one is harmonize. The revised TCC-SCA provide a way to harmonize the chemical regulation in Taiwan with the international one. And in return, it also reduced the ambiguity and the burden for enterprises. And it also harmonized the valid period of the CBI. Second, the amended TCC-SCA adjusts the requirement for Phase 1 registration, which I will talk about later. And in terms of a SIM profile, the Taiwan's EPA will no longer issue the registration certificate, but once a substance is approved, a registration number and other official document will be issued. The last one is the introduction of standard registration for 106 priority existing chemicals. And this has started already from January this year. And in addition to this is the annual report requirement. So in addition to the amendment of TCC-SCN on January last year, on March, the Taiwan's EPA also amended the regulations of new and existing chemical substance registration. And this is the legal framework for chemical registration in Taiwan. And the legal base is Chapter 7 in the TCSCA and the Chapter 30 on the revised TCC-SCA. And so this registration includes what should be registered and also have a clear description on who can register. So first, I would like to talk about the exemptions. So basically, this regulation regulates all chemicals, but except those, for example, like substance which occur in nature, and chemical substance that used for test run in a machine or equipment. And as you can see here, byproducts or impurities that are no commercial applications. And the mixture is also exempted, but individual constitute of mixture need to register. And the polymer of the 2% rule is applicable here. And other substance or chemical substance that are already regulated by other regulation, for example, the Agrochemical Management Act or the Tobacco and Alcohol Administration Act, those are already registered by other act is also exempted for the chemical registration here. Now, I would like to talk about who can register chemicals. So according to Taiwan's EPA, only Taiwanese manufacturers and importers and third-party representative with a legal base in Taiwan can register to the EPA. For companies that are outside Taiwan, they cannot directly register to EPA, and they can also not appoint the third-party representative to register chemical substance on their behalf. However, companies outside Taiwan can have agreement with the TPR, and the TPR will communicate with the Taiwanese importers, which are usually the buyers of the non-Taiwanese companies. And then the Taiwanese importers can prepare TPR appointment later. And by this way, the EPA will accept the TPR situation. So to summarize quickly, how can a TPR help you and your company? The first one is the supply chain communication. TPR can communicate directly with your Taiwanese buyer to proceed the TPR appointment as required by the EPA. And the second part is to do the phase 1 registration and the standard registration if the substance is listed on the 106 PEC list. And for standard registration, this includes the dossier preparation. Now, I would like to talk about the chemical registration for the existing chemicals. So in Taiwan, the inventory is called Taiwan Chemical Substance Inventory, TCSI. And this inventory contains more than 100,000 substances that has been manufactured or imported into Taiwan between 1993 and 2014. And according to the regulation of new and existing chemical substance registration and Article 15, for any existing substances that are first manufactured or imported with an annual volume of 100 kilograms, then the registrant should, within 6 months from the date of the fact, to apply for phase 1 registration. And if we look closely, so the phase 1 registration applies to manufacturers and importers and the quantity is more than 100 kilogram per year. And the information that required for phase 1 registration are name of the substances, the case number, and the secondly is the tonnage band in the calendar year, which is the estimated one. And number 3, information on use, and 4, the use information of this chemical, the product type. So the scenario 1 is if you are exporting to Taiwan of the existing chemicals with more than 100 kilogram, then it's required for phase 1 registration. And the scenario 2 is that if the chemical substances is less than 100 kilogram, then it is still possible to do phase 1 registration according to the Taiwan's EPA. And the second part is about the standard registration for existing chemicals. According to the Article 16 of the regulation, the Central Competent Authority can by stages designate a list of existing chemical substances subject to standard registration. And when the EPA released the amendment last year, they also issued the first batch of the pack list, which is 106 chemicals. And as you can see here, it's on the Appendix 6. And the information required for standard registration, as we will see later, is listed in the Appendix 6 of the regulation. And the standard registration requirement already starts from the January 1st this year. So for standard registration of the existing chemicals, the information requirement is depending on the tonnage band. There are 4 levels. The level 1 refers to loads between 1 and 10 tons. And the level 2 is between loads 10 and 100 tons. And level 3 is between 100 and 1,000 tons. And level 4 is more than 1,000 tons. And the information required here are, as you can see here, include 9 sections. The first one is the information of a registrant, the basic identification of the substances. And the second part is the information on manufacture, use, and exposure of the substances. And number 3, the hazard classification and the labeling. And number 4, safe use information. And number 5 is the physical and the chemical properties. And number 6 is the toxicological information. And 7, ecotoxicological information. And 8 and 9, hazard assessment and exposure assessment. And depending on the tonnage band, there is a different requirement of the number of data that need to be submitted. And in Taiwan, co-registration is possible, and data sharing is accessible to Section 3, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And according to the guidance of the existing chemical substance standard registration that issued in June this year, for standard registration, it will accept 3 types of data here. The first one is the international public information, and I will talk about this later. And the second part is one of the following, for example, like QSAR estimation or read across, systematic review, or testing proposal. And the last one is the testing report. So just to remind you again, for standard registration, it applies to those that are in the pack list of those 106 pack list. And it's more than 1 ton per year, then it's required to do standard registration. And for the section 3 to 5, the data can come from the international public information. So by international public information, Taiwan's EPA lists all the database that is possible to get the data from. And this is for number 5, 6, and 7 section for the standard registration. Now I will move on to new chemical registration. And similar to the existing chemical registration, the new chemical here is also depending on the tonnage band. For new chemical substances, there are three types of registration. The first one is small quantity registration, which refers to those below 100 kilograms. And the second part is the simplified registration between 100 kilograms and 1 ton. And for those above 1 ton, it will require standard registration, but also depending on the tonnage band and have different levels from 1 to 4. And for new chemical, the Taiwan's EPA also divided into different categories. For example, if it's for scientific research and development, the R&D, the simplified registration is required only above 1 ton or between 1 and 10 tons. And for process-oriented research and development and on-site isolated intermediates and polymer, it also have different requirements. As you can see, it's from the small quantity registration, small simplified registration, and standard registration, and only for level 1. And as for polymer of low concern, when company need to do new chemical registration on this, they need to apply a certificate from the government first before they can do the small quantity registration. And here you can also see the CMR substance registration. So for new chemical registration, here are the information required. And now I will talk about the timeline for standard registration. So there are two types of timeline. For the first one is the for existing chemical substances. If the enterprise have already obtained the phase 1 registration number before 2020, then they have a deadline on 2022 and 2021, depending on the tonnage band. And for the tonnage band that more than 100 tons, then the deadline is next year. And if it's between 1 and 100 tons, the deadline is 2022. And for the enterprise that obtained the phase 1 registration number for the first time after December 31st, 2019, then it has a different case-by-case deadline for standard registration. If it's between 1 and 100 tons, then it's within 3 years from the 1st of January of the following year. And if it's more than 100 tons, then it's within 2 years. And for new chemical substances, they need to apply for registration 19 days before the manufacture or import. And now we will move on to the registration fee. So for existing chemical substances, there are two types of registration, phase 1 registration and the standard registration. For phase 1 registration, the EPA will charge registrant 100 NT dollar, New Taiwan dollar, which is about €3. And for standard registration is 15,000, which is about 1,500 euros. And for new chemical substances, there are three types of registration, which are small quantity registration, simplified registration, and the standard registration. And the fee for small and the simplified registration is the fee for small quantity registration is 2,000, and for simplified registration is 20,000. And the standard registration is the same as the existing chemical substances, which is 50,000. And for new chemical substance that belong to polymer of low concern, then the fee is 1,000 NTD. And for small and medium enterprises and the research institute, they can have 25% discounts. Now I will move on to the confidential business information. So the companies can apply for CBI, and the information that can be disclosed are identification of registrant, identification of the chemical substances, and information on manufacture or imports, and the use of chemical substances. And you can see from the table here, for new chemical substances, the CBI, the valid period is 5 years. And this also includes the polymer of low concern if it's a small quantity. And for new chemical substances, simplified registration and small quantity registration, the valid period of CBI is 2 years. And for these two categories, the companies can apply for extension, but with the maximum confidential period for 15 years. For existing chemical substances, which include phase 1 registration and standard registration, the CBI is 5 years, and with the possibility to extend it to 10 years. Last, I would like to introduce the annual reporting. So according to the registration regulation, Taiwan's EPA also wants the companies to do annual reporting between April 1st and the 30th of September every year. And what information should be included in this annual reporting? They are substance name and the case number, and the registration number for each substances, and the volume in the previous year, and the information on importers and manufacturers. So to quickly summarize the compliance requirement for Taiwan's TCC-SCA here. So if you are exporting new chemical substances in Taiwan, then it will be 3 types of registration, which are small quantity, simplified, and standard registration. And if it's also belong to the category of polymer of low concern or R&D, then it requires to apply for notification before the registration process. And if you are exporting existing chemical substance to Taiwan, then you will need to do the phase 1 registration if the annual volume is more than 100 kilograms. And then depending on the chemical substances, if it's happen to be on the 106 packed list, then it is, and also the tonnage ban is more than 1 ton per year, then it is required for standard registration. So to summarize what companies should be aware, the first action is to assessment of the substances, to know if it's new or existing substances under Taiwan's regulation, and if these substances is on the pack list. And the second part is to do phase 1 registration. And the third one is if these substances is on the packed list, then you need to do the standard registration, including the dossier preparation. And if it's a new chemical substance registration, then this registration need to be done 90 days before the manufacture or import. And no matter if it's new chemical substances or existing chemical substances, then you need to do annual reporting. And here you need to do the data maintenance and the reporting. Now I will move on to the take-home message. So in order to comply with Taiwan's TCC-SCA, it's important to know what what chemicals are exported to Taiwan, and then be aware of the timeline for registration. And because of the TPR mechanism, it's important to communicate within the supply chain for the information exchange for the compliance. And how can the TPR help you and your company to keep your business in the business competitiveness in the Taiwanese market and maintain the confidentiality of the substances? Then TPR can help you with both phase 1 registration and the standard registration, and also the following data maintenance in the annual reporting. And I would like to thank you, and we will move on to the Q&A session.